Hi, my name is Shreeya. I'm a senior here at the University of Delaware. I study computer science and political science, and everyone can hear me, right? Just want to make sure everyone can hear me. And I'm also a part of the University Cybersecurity Scholars Program. So I guess you guys are wondering, why would I add more homework to my plate? Well, I actually am very passionate about cybersecurity, and I try to combine both my technical knowledge with the political knowledge to create and see trends within cybersecurity in modern times. And the reason why I chose this topic in particular is because we always think of cyber attacks as like data breaches or something that happens in very abstract thoughts, but there are very physical consequences to some of the actions that we do in cyberspace. So I just wanted to draw that connection. And then the one other disclaimer I have is I'm going to be defining a lot of maybe seemingly obvious definitions, only because as a student and because there's a wide variety of people here, I just want to make sure these terms are accessible. And then the last disclaimer is my nose is a bit congested because one thing about Delaware is that the weather always changes. So if you can't understand me, please let me know, because sometimes my nose gets congested and my voice, like my words slur a bit. But hopefully I should be in the clear for this. But here I just wanted to There we go. I wanted to step into my presentation. Here I will just go in a brief introduction on what I mean by physical security. I wanted to talk about the scope of the project because I had to narrow down my research by a lot to really show you the trends that I wanted to show you, and then also give you some historical context of how cyber threats affect the physical world. Then I wanted to go into a couple case studies from these three industries. There's healthcare, transportation, and energy. Then I wanted to, again, give you a trend analysis, just not only by industry, but just a big picture of what is happening in the physical world in relation to cybersecurity. I wanted to connect and what I mean here by big picture is I wanted to give a more humanitarian lens to cyber attacks as well. I'm going to introduce a topic of human security, which is a framework by the United Nations, and that's getting into the political science aspect of my background. I wanted to bring up some questions about the future of cybersecurity, because all of us here are cybersecurity educators, professionals, and can make a lot of change in the future of how cyberspace will look. So I just wanted to pose some questions, and then here's some takeaways that you can start implementing into your institution once you get a bigger picture of how these cyber attacks affect the physical realm. So with further ado, here is an introduction. This is an infographic that I got from CISA, and it just clearly outlines how physical assets such as these IoT medical devices, electronic records, the smart grid, and so on and so forth are connected to various cyber assets like healthcare network systems, systems that are required for transportation, and the smart grid for energy sectors. I focused on these three. I didn't really focus too much on industrial control systems, but this is just a visualizer to start priming how we connect the physical and the cyber world together. So here I wanted to just justify my scope a bit. When I was doing the research for this, I realized there are a lot of cyber attacks that have actual physical consequences, but I wanted to make it a bit more clear in my scope only just so that's easier to see directed trends so that you have a better picture of what's happening rather than just a lot of scattered case studies. So I did a chronological scope as well as something on attribution, which I'll get into in a little bit. Here with the scope, I looked at the past 5 years only because 5 years is still a bit relevant, still a bit recent in terms of cyber. Honestly, near the ender of that time frame, it might be getting to old news, but I still wanted to bring that all in, especially considering the pandemic. 5 years goes before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and during lockdown, as well as in the current world. So now you can also see how the pandemic is affecting these cyber attacks and how they're affecting the physical world. And then I wanted to get into how I narrowed my scope through attribution, or who's to blame, I would say. So I used nation states or political motives, any case that has those type of trends, only because as also a political science major, that goes into my coursework, but also because nation states or people and organizations with political motives, that can even include individual cyber criminal groups that just have huge amount of resources, because any attack that has a wide spread effect on the physical world, such as your industry sectors, your infrastructure, needs to have a huge amount of resources, and it's usually those groups that get those resources. So here, now I'm going to define physical security so we're all on the same page here. Physical security is the protection of physical systems, so that's the people involved. Take that as your security guards, your technicians, to even some of your clients. It's the property, such as the buildings, the transportation vehicles, as well as any physical assets involved. This can go as big as servers, the physical servers, to even like the wires involved in networking. So that's a general overview of the physical systems. And then I wanted to just add on a little bit more, again, bringing it back to that humanitarian lens of a tenet of the well-being of the physical world. So many people would consider that more of like a mental type of situation, but I still feel like cyber attacks, especially when they cause immense panic and chaos, and especially when they're caused by a lot of these nation-state and political actors, it's important to also understand the well-being of your clients and the well-being of the people involved as well. So that's just two things that I wanted to add on and expand upon the definition of physical security here. And here is a historical attack. For those who know, Stuxnet is a very popular attack. It's known as the world's first cyber weapon. It was launched around 2009 to 2010 under Operation Olympic Games. This was allegedly attributed to the United States and partially Israel, and this was around the time that the Iranian nuclear facilities were gaining a lot of power. And because of the fear of Iran becoming a nuclear state, there was this attack on their centrifuges. So essentially, to take a step back, Stuxnet is a computer worm, which means it's a virus that gets onto one system and it can propagate itself throughout the network through other devices. So it's a bit more advanced than your normal malware because a malware requires someone to physically inject it into a device, and then that device has to be able to spread it to other devices. Here, as long as it's connected to a network, it can spread wherever. So it is very efficient and very quick, as well as very advanced. So how this works and how I'm going to connect it back to physical security is that this worm, let me take it a little bit backwards. Centrifuges, especially with the nuclear power, I'm not entirely familiar with this, but they need to spin at a certain speed in order to harvest that uranium for nuclear power. Stuxnet, what it did was it slowly and undetectably affected the speed of those centrifuges. By slowing them down a bit, they rendered all that uranium useless. So this is going back to the assets. The uranium and the centrifuges itself were not able to be used for nuclear power, severely weakening Iranians' aspirations to become a nuclear state. And nearly 1,000 Iranian centrifuges were destroyed. So that's just to paint a picture that this is a very historical connection between the cyber attacks and the physical world. And as you can see here, it caused a lot of damage in this industry. So here I'm going to go into my case studies. I have a couple per each sector, as well as I wanted to look at both the domestic and the international cases, just to show that this is not just a U.S.-centric or U.S.-specific issue. This is an issue that is incredibly global, and we also should think more internationalist when it comes to these issues. So the first one I wanted to mention is a very popular one, the Colonial Pipeline attack. This attack was detected May 7th, 2021, even though, and this we'll get into a little bit later, we may not know exactly when that malware was injected into a system, how long it's been in the system, and when the attack might have actually occurred. So here, this attack was attributed to the DarkSide Hacker Group, which is an Eastern European group. Although they claim to be apolitical and they claim to not want to cause any damage, clearly they have caused damage. And there is oftentimes Eastern European governments or governments in general take help from cyber criminal groups. So there is the potential of a political attribution here as well. So this was a ransomware attack, and ransomware is basically a type of malware that encrypts your files. So these are incredibly important files to allow for operation of your industry. And when those are encrypted, you have to pretty much shut down. until you pay a ransom to decrypt those files. However, the FBI suggests that you don't pay the ransom only because there's no guarantee that you're going to get your files back. So a little bit of the Colonial Pipeline. It is a huge petroleum pipeline that goes from Texas to New York, basically the East Coast. It supplies the East Coast with 45 to 55% of its energy. So a ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline caused a complete energy shutdown for a good amount of time. Even though it might have been lasting a couple days, that's still enough to cause immense panic. There was immense consumer panic. People were buying gas intensely. Prices were increasing. Flights like Southwest Airlines had to reroute just because they had fuel shortages. So here's that physical aspect of it. Not only did it cause chaos, that well-being, but it did cause people to actually rethink their transportation and rethink how they're going to get energy for a couple of days. The next one I wanted to look at was the Ukraine Viasat attack. If you saw my presentation last year on Russian attacks on Ukraine during the beginning of the Russian-Ukraine war, I mentioned this, and I thought it was appropriate to bring it back because it's actually really interesting how these attacks allow for certain political actions and military actions to occur more smoothly. So the Viasat attack happened February 24th, 2022, which coincided with the official invasion of Russia into Ukraine. So this was attributed to the Russian military agency or intelligence agency, or GRU. And it's also known as the acid rain attack. It was a two-parter attack where it needed a distributed denial of service attack as well as a malware wiper. And malware wipers essentially, once they're installed onto a device, once they're injected into a device, it wipes off all the data, rendering that device useless. So Viasat is a communication satellite service. So by both doing a DDoS attack and a malware wiper on those modems, it caused a blackout in communication, not just in Ukraine, but all throughout Europe, only because Viasat is so prevalent throughout many other European countries. But not coincidentally, these modems were especially wiped by the border between Russia and Ukraine. So by blacking out the communications over there, now what happens is the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian military can't communicate, can't share information. There's insecurity of information on that border. And the Russian military is much more smoothly able to come into the nation. So here what we're seeing is, again, a cyber attack that is allowing physical actions, physical military actions to happen more smoothly here. So now I wanted to go into the transportation sector. So these would be like your public transportation systems, your buses, your trains, your subways. And we're going to get into this a little bit later, they don't seem to have a lot of physical damage yet, but there's huge possibility for it, as we're going to see. So the first one I wanted to look into was the MTA breach, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority's breach, which is all of the subways, especially in New York City. And as we know about New York City, their subways are incredibly important and one of the biggest systems in the nation, if not the world. So they're very, very important to the smooth operations of the city, which also makes them a very promising target. So this attack was attributed to the Chinese government here. The attack happened in early April, or it seemed to have that the malware was injected in early April, but it was detected late April. So here we're seeing a gap between when the malware was actually injected to when we actually detected it. So by then, any potential damage could have already happened and we wouldn't have known. This was a zero-day vulnerability in Pulse Connect Secure. So the Pulse Connect Secure software is basically a way for employees to log in to the employer network remotely. Because as you see by the date, this was still during lockdown, still during like the midst of the pandemic. So a lot of remote work was happening, so which makes it a very easy target for any type of actors to launch a cyber attack. And with the Chinese government, there have been some worries considering that a lot of the rail cars were created in China, though I wouldn't blame this attack specifically on that. And that might not be a productive way of doing that. That's just more context, more political context to add here. The MTA has also been breached. This was like 2 times before this as well. And with the Chinese government, usually they launch cyber attacks for financial gain, where they get the money to launch and get more types of funding for their operations. However, this attack didn't seem to require any money. It didn't seem to demand any money. It wasn't a ransomware attack. It was just exploiting a 0-day or a vulnerability in software that has yet to be discovered. There was no severe damages either. 3 out of the 18 systems were impacted, but this didn't stop operations. This didn't stop the transportation of the subways. And it didn't even seem to have a data breach. There didn't seem to be any compromise or tampering within the data. So then why would I bring up this case? Here, it's important to see the possibility of what could happen next. This is known as a cyber espionage case here, where instead of purposefully trying to attack or hinder some sort of operations, actors will launch or inject malware in just to see not only how far they can go, but to get a good understanding of how the system works from the inside. So this is exactly one of those cases. They're not exactly trying to get anything out of this rather than how the MTA works. So it's important to keep that in mind and further our cyber hygiene in these areas, because this only leads and paves the way easier for potential cyber attacks that could actually cause some devastating damages here. And then here's a more international context. This is the Metrolinx attack that happened January 2018. So this is actually before the pandemic. So while the MTA one was during the pandemic, it was much easier. You just needed the government just found a 0-day and was able to inject into that. Here, this required a couple more different steps to attack the system. So the Metrolinx is a provincially run Toronto Subway Transit Authority here. And this attack was attributed to North Korea. And again, the North Korean government at the time was very active with, you've heard of WannaCry, especially the attacks that happened with the British healthcare industry. And similarly to the Chinese government, the North Korean government also has a habit of launching attacks for financial gain to fund other operations. But again, this attack didn't really seem to have any financial gain. It wasn't another ransomware attack. And in fact, the attackers breached a firewall and also injected malware in another act of cyber espionage to see how the system operates. Because there were no severe damages to the system, the transits were operating fine, and there was also, again, no data breach. There was no tampering of any data or systems there. There was only one server out of many that was affected. So this is another case of cyber espionage, and you can also see that as the actual attack was routed through Russia. The IP that during the firewall attack was actually a Russian IP number. So it shows that there are actors who are trying to also obfuscate the actual attribution of the attack to themselves, making it even more concerning, number one, we don't know if there is something in our systems without proper detection. But number two, even if we do find something, who do we attribute it to? So now I wanted to get into the last section here with the healthcare industry. And this one is incredibly pressing because of the pandemic and because with healthcare comes actual loss of life in some of these cases. So here I wanted to look at the County Ireland hospital attack. This happened in May 2022. I don't have specific dates here again because there is a gap between when this malware was actually injected versus when it was detected. So again, there's that gap, so there could be potential damages that we didn't pick up on beforehand. So Conti is a ransomware as service, which means there's just ransomware that cyber criminal groups or nation states can buy and use. And it's also, in some sources that I looked at, Conti was also the name of the Russian cyber group. Again, this cyber criminal group claims to be independent, but again, there's a potential of possible ties to the Russian government themselves. So as you see here, there's 2 months between the actual intrusion and the attack. So there was enough time, again, to collect data, see what's going on in these systems, and cause damages that may have been undetected. But the thing with the Conti Island hospital attack is it caused not only $100 million in damages, it took weeks for the system to come back. Because with the ransomware attack, you're encrypting important files, you're encrypting medical data files, you're encrypting even like stuff like outpatient files. That hinders the system completely, causing almost a shutdown. So it took a while for them to get their systems back up. But in the midst of that, it delayed hospital functions. So think about your hospital treatments, your surgeries, even mundane things like prescriptions. When that's all hindered and when you encrypt those, then that could lead to a matter of life or death for some of these patients, especially when it comes to life-critical surgeries. So here, not only now are we seeing the realm of physical damage and just mental not well-being, you're seeing an actual loss of life here. And that's something I wanted to emphasize with the Maui ransomware attack. This happened in May 2021 as well, and this attack was attributed to North Korea. And however, the initial access vectors, such as when this malware might have been injected versus who exactly could have launched this attack, are unknown, or where in the system of American hospitals has this ransomware been injected here. Again, with encryption of medical data, that means electronic health records, diagnostics, imaging, and even like the intranet. So not only are you encrypting files, now even hospital staff workers can't communicate with each other. And that, again, causes a huge delay in hospital operations. And another thing I wanted to emphasize with both of these cases is this was in the midst of the pandemic. So not only is these industries incredibly vulnerable, there's an incredible increase of patients who need sometimes it's a matter of life or death for them there. With the midst of the pandemic and the act of virtual work, here you're seeing, again, these systems are becoming incredibly vulnerable and allowing attackers to target them. And another thing is, with both this attack as well as the previous attack, a lot of these institutions are also responsible for research with the COVID vaccine virus. So not only are they encrypting and trying to get a financial gain out of this, some suggest that there was even some sort of espionage occurring to gain COVID vaccine data. So here you're seeing a wide variety of layers into especially healthcare when it comes to the cybersecurity connections with the physical world. And here I just wanted to highlight this graph. If I remember, this was from CrowdStrike, but you can check me back on that one when I have my sources listed at the end. But this graph essentially shows not necessarily the increase in ransomware, but how easy it is to deploy, how quick it is to deploy ransomware. And as you can see, it started off declining, obviously, as cybersecurity and cyber weapons start to increase and start to get more advanced. But just by 2020, you see that sharp turn because of the pandemic, because of remote work. And it's unprecedented remote work, I would say. You see an increase in the rapidness in the deployment. So again, this is an incredibly important pressing issue, especially when it comes to physical security, as well as the livelihoods of some people. So here I wanted to just show some trends here before I get into more of the bigger picture stuff. And here I divided it by the different industries first, and then I'm going to go back and take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Here with the energy, you see more of a widespread effect on operations. So if, let's say, a group or a nation state or some sort of actor wants to cause chaos within a wide geographical range, typically they tend to choose the energy sector because that's where your blackouts are, that's where your energy shortages are, that's where your communication shortages are, or blackouts are. So that allows for a more widespread effect and also can cause a lot more chaos within a lot more people, considering how prevalent energy is to all of our lives. With the transportation industry, I have not seen that many attacks that physically cause any sort of insecurity with the transportation operations, or shut down transportation or cause any threat to lives. What I've seen, though, is most of these are reconnaissance missions. They're mainly places where actors, such as nation states, can go and really see how these systems work and how they operate, and then potentially use that data for later on. So that's why it's important to address these issues now, just so that later on doesn't happen, or we know how to mitigate that later on situation. And lastly, with the healthcare industry, you're seeing that they're increasingly at risk post-COVID because of all the stuff that I just mentioned before, the increase in the use of healthcare, as well as the ability of remote work. And pressingly, the healthcare industry so far has been the one that's been directly related to loss of life. So I'm going to get into the bigger picture trends here. A lot of that ultimately comes down to chaos. A lot of these organizations, they may not claim to cause damage, but they're definitely causing chaos within the people, within the communities, and within institutions, because all three of these are required for a smooth operation of any society and any nation. And it's also important to get a little bit more technical. A lot of these attacks require malware. Only one of them used a distributed denial of service attack, but if you go a step further, let's say recent cyber attacks on airports typically were a DDoS attack on shutting down their websites. So you're seeing both a network-related attack as well as malware, specifically ransomware, because there is that financial gain option to that, as well as encrypting files is a very efficient way to stop a lot of operations. The range of damage, though, is intense. There's physical damage to loss of life. So when you're taking away from this presentation, try to make sure that every single possibility is accounted for here. While there's physical damage, it's pretty easy to picture. Think about, how do people's lives come into play with this institution, with the work that I'm doing, because of how widespread physical insecurity can be. And then again, obviously, infrastructure is increasingly at risk here. And that is another just place that we need to focus our operations on. And here I wanted to just introduce that bigger picture, that human security framework. So it is a framework suggested by the United Nations. It's in addition to national security, and it can be useful in addressing cybersecurity on a bigger national or global level. So there are 7 components of human security. Let's see if I remember it without looking. There's personal, community, economic, political, food, health, and environmental. Now, some of these you can kind of tell the key connection. Some of them are what is going on? How does cyber attack affect food security? Well, they may not directly. The biggest thing about human security is all 7 of these components are interlinked. So, for example, anything on economic security, anything that affects economic security, such as a famine, or such as, a famine could cause, obviously, food shortages, which also then can cause economic security when you think of exports and imports. So there is they're closely connected, but may not be directly connected to cybersecurity. But there are the key ones here, the first four ones that I listed out that have some sort of connection to cybersecurity here. Personal security is your well-being. It's not only the security of the physical, but also how you're feeling. And as we know, if any of us were to face issues like identity fraud, that would be stressful. That is physical insecurity here. And as I mentioned with the chaos component of these attacks, that is a direct threat to physical or personal security. There is community security. That is a wider spread level. So think of the energy sector attacks. That's not affecting an individual person. Rather, that's affecting the regional community. And even thinking about COVID-19 in hospitals, think about the communities who are disproportionately affected by COVID who end up in those hospitals. Those are the ones who are also at a disproportionate rate of community insecurity. Economic insecurity can be a clear line with the ransomware attacks. Ransomware requires immense amount of money to be paid sometimes, but also with the County Ireland hospital attacks, over $100 million of damage. So that shows a huge insecurity in that industry economically. And then political insecurity, that's why I also connected my scope to more political attributions, because, again, all of these industries, all of these sectors are necessary for smooth operation of our country and of our society. And affecting one of them and threatening one of them threatens the political makeup of our nation as well. And then the other, health security, actually is pretty directly linked too with COVID-19 and the healthcare industry as well. And then the other two kind of follow through, but not that important to discuss. It's important to see how majorly all these components of human security are connected to the cyber attacks that we're talking about. I'm going to skip over this because I think we already put it in context, but if you have any questions about Pegasus and that connected to human security, feel free to come up to me. But again, this is our big picture that I wanted to mention. Cybersecurity is human security, and human security is physical security. So these are all combined, these triad, and it's important not to just incorporate one of them in your analysis, but all of them. Especially as cybersecurity experts, we have to understand the physical consequences, especially when it comes to property, but also the more human consequences of a potential attack. There are various intentions, and this is something I wanted to discuss a little bit about. There are attacks that are deliberately physical. Again, we don't know the entire motives of these groups. We can't even properly claim that these groups conducted these attacks. But for example, with DarkSide, who claimed to have no damages, there was clear physical damages there. And that's a question of, did they mean for physical? Did they mean for that chaos? Did they mean for those energy shortages? Or was that just something they just woke up one day and decided to do? There are also, and that's where it comes into the physical threats as a byproduct. When there is a cyber attack that is launched, maybe threatening the physical side of the world isn't necessarily on an attacker's mind, but that's still what happens, whether or not they intended it to be. There is, with the deliberate physical threats, that's what brings into question, was it the motive for some of these attackers to look at hospitals and actually cause loss of life, or was that, again, a byproduct? Even though it's important to distinguish those intentions, that's still, the damage is already done, and it's still important to understand how that damage is done. And then again, this is circling back to the beginning. These attacks require immense resources. These are incredibly powerful and financially backed groups, and that helps us assess and also address and use that information for our mitigation responses. And here, these are some questions about the future of cybersecurity. I personally do not have the answers to these. If I did, I feel like the world would be a better place, but I think this is something that we all have to think about and discuss moving forward. There is that attribution issue I brought up. How do we know who did what? A lot of times in technical reports, they're able to attribute it to a group because of a certain signature or because of a precedence that group set. But that's not for certain. So if we don't know who conducted the attack, how can we protect ourselves from another attack from that same group? That is a huge question because there's so much ambiguity within cybersecurity, especially with the second point I have here, spillover effects. Because the world is so intricately connected by the internet and by digital systems, you can't contain the effects of one attack. Like say there's multiple hospitals that use a network to communicate with each other. An attack on one of those hospitals affects all the other hospitals as well. So even though someone might have a vendetta against hospital A, hospital B, C, D, and E, all throughout the world are affected then too. So how do we think about that? How do we consider those as well? How do we imagine the possibility of damage further beyond that one institution? And that gets into also this declaration of war. Going back to the Viasat attack, even though that attack was specifically for Ukraine, it affected countries all across Europe. So how do we think about warfare in terms of the cyber world here? We don't have grounded lines of, oh, this is country A's cyberspace versus this is country B's cyberspace. But the definition of a declaration on war is when there's a physical harm happening to one nation. So now that we have these physical things that are happening, these physical outcomes and threats because of cybersecurity, in the cyber world, how do we look at warfare? How do we look at declarations of war? Would we consider it a declaration of war, especially because we can't attribute it? So these are all questions that we need to think about in the bigger space of cyberspace as well as cyber sovereignty. And again, this is me just being a political science nerd, but I feel like everyone here who has some investment in cybersecurity has some idea or some questions on these topics, because it is an ambiguous world and we all need to, again, we're all in this together. We all got to figure out these solutions. I wanted to be a bit optimistic at the end here, so I wanted to look at some takeaways. This is also, again, recommendations by CISA, by this idea of convergence, where you, as an institution, converge both the cyber operations and the physical operations so that there's communication between the two, so that mitigation responses happen more smoothly. So the first one is communication. That's just reaching out, both sides reaching out to each other, establishing leadership roles, establishing governance policies. Then there's coordination. This is more finalizing those roles, finalizing plans of mitigation, and again, coordinating between this is what cybersecurity operations do versus this is what physical security operations do, and then how do we combine them together? And then that ties into collaboration, making a nice chain of command so that when there is a cyber attack that happens, you're incorporating, okay, there is a cyber attack on a server, but how does that affect the asset in the physical security realm? So these are all here to ease the path between the cyber world and the physical world so that these damages don't cause that much harm or that have that much of an impact. These are all ways to mitigate, and also best practices to continue that. Sorry, it's a little early. I can't. My words are tripping a bit. But to continue that communication between the two, because as I said here, and what I was trying to do in this presentation, the cyber world and the physical world are inherently linked, even though a lot of literature and a lot of the discussion may not say that, and many of these attack reports may not mention that explicitly, but they are linked. So we also have to make sure our institutions reflect that. So here is a special thanks to my sources. If you have any questions or if you want to learn more, feel free to email me here. And also talk to me if you see me, because, again, I love talking about this type of stuff. I feel like the more we talk about it, the more answers we have to these questions, and then the more safe and secure the world can be. But thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you, Shreeya. Interesting presentation. Thank you for fighting through your cold there. These incidences that you present, selected to present here, are they particularly notorious and infamous events? And B, how many of those cases did they pay the ransom?
Mm-hmm. So honestly, some of these were pretty popular, like the Colonial Pipeline attack, but a lot of the I personally haven't heard of the MTA attack, which I do feel like is incredibly important to look into, but again, I didn't see that much media coverage on, so I wanted to get not only the more notorious, like the popular ones, but the ones who may not have gotten a lot of media coverage, but are incredibly important to understand and learn, especially because some of those attacks didn't have a physical, like a tangible effect to them. Sometimes they didn't get that much coverage, but that's something I wanted to address here to show that there are a variety of different attacks that may have gone under the public eye, but should be useful to cybersecurity experts. And then your second part of the question?
What percentage of those paid the ransom?
So from my understanding, with the FBI not suggesting to pay the ransom, I say, I don't know exact percentage. I think that's an interesting question. Honestly, not that many institutions, especially in the U.S., would pay the ransom, only because at that point they bring in their own cyber team. As big as some of these attacks can be, the government gets involved, especially with infrastructure. So I don't know if there is a majority that pay the ransom.
Did the hackers ever double cross the people who pay the ransom?
Yes, so that's one of the reasons why the FBI actually suggests not to pay the ransom, because, again, there's no guarantee that you're going to get those files back that they're encrypted. They could just get the money and just leave it at that. So they're at a double loss. Yep.
Did any of the articles suggest that they used their backups to correct the issue or otherwise, how they solved the issues?
Yeah, so I think especially with recent times and with the more prevalence of ransomware becoming a more general public topic rather than a very specific cybersecurity topic, I think a lot of companies have started to have backups and start using them, especially in the advent of the pandemic. I think before the pandemic, sometimes there haven't been, there might have been backups, but again, that response or that policy may not have been in place. And again, I can only speak from a U.S. context. I don't know other nations' idea with cybersecurity, but I think that's something that I've noticed in the United States.
In relation to the ones you mentioned, because we were reading all those articles, I thought maybe they had
I think
asked if they didn't pay the ransom or otherwise, what they might have done or how they solved it.
right, yeah, I think a lot of the American cases seem to be on that side.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Shreeya, excellent presentation, thank you. Just a question. I don't know if you've thought about this or read anything about it, but there are certain physical aspects to this, but I'm wondering, does this information fit into the realm of cybersecurity?
That's a great question. That gets me all excited. I feel like it does, because cybersecurity is the security of your networks as well as the data and the information that's being transferred over. So a manipulation of that information should be honestly considered within the cybersecurity realm. It is a very prevalent topic within political science. I know that for a fact, and it does have very physical implications, as well as, again, with the human security, the 7 topics, it is very directed to the political security. So as you see, there's all these threads that I'm trying to tie together with the physical aspect, the human security aspect, and then, yes, I do feel like it should be considered under the cybersecurity umbrella as well. Yep.
So the cases that you presented were a lot of public sector or government entities. The private sector seems to be a lot more dark when it comes to these attacks and sharing this information. Do you think it would be beneficial for a government agency like the United States government to step in and start mandating if these attacks occur to a company, require them to be reported and the information is shared so that you can get a better understanding of the private industry and financial impacts to the private industry?
Yeah, that's a good question. That gets into like the policy side of things. I do want to say at first, it was very hard to actually find some information on some of these attacks, like the Metrolinx attack in Toronto, and even trying to find incredible technical information on the MTA attacks also was pretty hard, because it seemed that they didn't, I guess the news didn't want to really disclaim when these attacks actually occurred, when the malware was in. While I don't know if that's part of the analysis and then they didn't choose to put that in, or whatever the situation is. I'm not sure about that. I do feel like there is definitely pros and cons to having the government be involved with the private sector. I think, yeah, the private sector tends to be more in the dark. There's a lot more, they usually use the defense of proprietary information and stuff like that. But for the greater of like the cyber community, as well as just for the, like say one financial company gets affected, for the collaboration of all of them, there should be like a consortium to share that information with, building so these companies can work together and share and pool that information of, oh, this is a cyber attack that happened, this is what happened. So that, sure, maybe there's proprietary information, but as from one financial company to another, and have like the government be a board of that, be able to understand and share that information, and then also release whatever is acceptable to the public. Because again, the public are the clients, they are the customers, so they should also be aware and involved in this situation.
So along those lines, the Security Exchange Commission is required here in the next couple of months for public companies to report any cyber incidents. I mean, that's going to be all public security companies.
They're putting out 34 crazy, the SEC is going a little nuts right now. I don't know how many of those will actually make it. But yeah, they're trying. It's happening, yeah.
Yep, any other questions? Oh, I see one hand in the back.
So many of these examples that you gave were essentially cyber attacks. They were from third-party external source attacking systems. Would you say that same principles apply if, not that it was an internal attack, but the one thing when I was thinking of all the scenarios was 2000, does anybody remember 2003, the Northeastern blackout? That was a software bug. Do you think the same principles like this, which is a software bug, which is not an attack, but just a hiccup in the system, these principles could apply the same way? It did create chaos, it did create disruption, it did create, pretty much whole New York City was shut down for 2 days. They thought it was a cyber attack, it was just simply just internal system failed.
I think that's a good point, and I think that continues on the broadening of what cybersecurity really means. And as we see historically, what we've thought of cybersecurity continues to evolve. Sometimes some people, cybersecurity is a very sensationalized topic. It's like, oh, this hacker is trying to get this information from this group or this entity. But the software bug is affecting the security of those systems, hence affecting cybersecurity. And I think these principles still apply, even though it might not have been, maybe some of the more political aspects of it, probably not. But I think the same aspect of analyzing, looking through that software, maybe having more involvement in those type of areas, and even getting open source or community responses on that as well would also be important to addressing stuff like software bugs, something that wasn't intentional at all, but still causes it. Because then you can't attribute that, or you can't see what the motive was. And that usually goes beyond, not something noticeable because it's an internal issue. But still having some of these principles of coordination and convergence can still help with the blackout that caused after that. Okay. Thank you.
I want to thank Shreeya for her fantastic presentation. So on behalf of Secure Delaware and DTI and everyone else, we want to thank you with a nice little certificate.
Thank you.